The day Ava Holloway disappeared from the family she thought would protect her was the exact day everything started quietly falling apart, even if nobody noticed it yet. At 16, after losing her father in a tragic accident and her mother years earlier, Ava believed the sprawling estate her father spent decades building would at least guarantee stability, but stability vanished the second her stepmother, Caroline, stepped in with fake concern, polished smiles, and paperwork Ava barely understood. Somehow, piece by piece, the inheritance meant for her slipped away while she was pushed into a tiny apartment, fed stories about financial struggles, and treated like a burden inside the very life her parents built. Bro, hearing stories like this always messes with my head because betrayal from strangers hurts, but betrayal from family lands differently. And what nobody in that family realized was terrifyingly simple: Ava wasn't gone forever, she was quietly preparing to come back with something nobody expected. Ava Holloway spent the first few months after her father's death living in a haze that honestly felt impossible to imagine unless you've watched your entire life collapse in slow motion. One moment she was the daughter of a respected property developer who spent weekends teaching her about responsibility, contracts, and something he repeated constantly: protect what belongs to you because people smile differently when money enters the room, and the next moment she was standing inside a cold office while adults in expensive clothes casually explained that complicated legal transitions meant temporary sacrifices had to happen. Temporary turned into permanent almost overnight. Her stepmother, Caroline Holloway, somehow became the center of every decision while Ava slowly became invisible inside her own life. The estate accounts became inaccessible. The family house changed atmosphere. Locks quietly changed on private rooms. Financial managers stopped returning Ava's questions, always redirecting her toward Caroline, who conveniently had polished answers for everything. According to her, debts existed Ava never knew about. Investments had supposedly collapsed. Liquidity problems appeared out of nowhere. Every explanation sounded professional enough to confuse a grieving teenager, and honestly, this is exactly how manipulation works in real life. It hides behind complicated language until questioning yourself feels easier than questioning the people lying to you. The emotional pressure only got worse. Caroline framed every concern as disrespect. If Ava questioned missing funds, she became ungrateful. If she asked about trust documents, she was too immature to understand. And then came the move that completely shifted everything. Caroline announced the estate had become financially unsustainable, claiming they needed to sell assets and simplify expenses, which somehow translated into Ava losing her room, her privacy, and eventually her place in the house entirely. Caroline's biological son, Mason, suddenly occupied spaces Ava once called hers while expensive renovations quietly continued around the property despite constant claims of financial hardship. Bro, hearing this part genuinely blew my mind because people really will say they're struggling while standing inside luxury they stole from someone else. Ava was relocated into a tiny apartment on the edge of town with just enough money to survive, packaged carefully as an act of generosity. Caroline framed it like support, telling relatives she was helping Ava become independent, while privately treating her like an inconvenience that needed removing before adulthood complicated legal ownership. For a while, Ava nearly believed she was powerless. She worked exhausting shifts at a cafe, balanced school, skipped meals to stretch rent money, and spent nights replaying memories of her father explaining business principles she thought she'd never use. But grief slowly turned into suspicion. Small details refused to leave her alone. Documents disappeared too conveniently. Signatures looked rushed. Former employees stopped speaking when she entered conversations. A longtime groundskeeper accidentally mentioned trust protections that should have kicked in once her father passed, then awkwardly walked the statement back like he had said too much. That single moment planted something dangerous in Ava's mind: doubt. And doubt became curiosity. She started researching quietly, using free public records computers at the library after work because she couldn't afford legal help. She learned words nobody had bothered teaching her before: probate, beneficiary rights, fiduciary duty, inheritance mismanagement. For night after night, she compared records, old emails, archived property filings, and strange transfers connected to shell companies she had never heard of. The deeper she looked, the uglier things started appearing. Properties originally tied to her father's holdings had shifted ownership under suspicious timelines. Loans appeared against estate assets. Trust language looked modified. Money vanished into corporate names that somehow connected back to Caroline through distant partnerships. This part honestly felt unreal because every answer only created bigger questions. The woman claiming financial disaster seemed to be living better than ever. Then came the moment that changed everything. Hidden inside an old storage box from her father's office, buried beneath receipts and faded notebooks, Ava found something Caroline clearly never expected her to see, a sealed legal packet addressed directly to her, unopened, dated weeks before her father died. And the second she read the first page, her entire understanding of what happened shattered. The moment Ava opened that sealed packet, the air around her felt different, like the entire story she had been living inside suddenly cracked open and revealed something darker underneath. Inside sat notarized copies of trust protections, handwritten instructions from her father, and one sentence that practically stopped her cold: if anything happened to him, the estate, including the company holding majority ownership of the HOA properties, was to remain protected in trust until Ava turned 21, with a third-party fiduciary legally responsible for oversight. Caroline was never supposed to have unrestricted control. She was never supposed to liquidate anything significant. She was never supposed to isolate Ava from the business at all. Bro, this part genuinely made my jaw drop because the betrayal wasn't emotional anymore, it looked calculated. At first Ava felt relief, but relief turned dangerous fast. If the documents were real, then somebody had ignored them, hidden them, or manipulated the process entirely. And once she understood that, fear entered the picture too. Because people willing to steal millions from a grieving teenager usually do not stop politely when their secret gets threatened. Still, Ava kept digging. Quietly. Carefully. She contacted the attorney listed in the packet, only to learn he had abruptly retired months after her father's death under circumstances that sounded suspiciously rushed. Financial contacts avoided questions. Emails disappeared. Former employees suddenly acted nervous the second Caroline's name entered conversation. It honestly felt like everyone knew something but nobody wanted to become the person who said it out loud. Then came the twist Ava never expected. Through archived filings and company records, she discovered Caroline and Mason were drowning in debt despite the luxurious image they projected. Massive loans had been taken against estate-backed holdings, risky investments failed quietly, and expensive lifestyles were being held together with borrowed time. The mansion renovations, luxury vacations, designer purchases, it all looked impressive on the outside, but underneath, cracks were spreading fast. And this is exactly the kind of entitlement story that feels unbelievable until you remember how often greed destroys people from the inside. But before Ava could even process it, another bomb dropped. A corporate notice surfaced showing something terrifying: unless outstanding obligations were resolved, majority ownership of the estate company could legally transfer through forced restructuring within months. Translation: the empire her father built was on the verge of leaving the family completely. And suddenly, Ava realized something chilling: Caroline hadn't just stolen her inheritance. She was actively destroying it. Once Ava understood the truth, something inside her shifted permanently. The sadness that once kept her frozen started turning into something sharper, quieter, and honestly far more dangerous: focus. Because this was no longer about proving she had been treated unfairly. Caroline hadn't simply manipulated paperwork or stolen money. She had gambled with Ava's future, erased her father's wishes, and nearly burned down an entire legacy while pretending to be the victim of financial hardship. Bro, this part felt unreal because some people really do create disasters and then act shocked when consequences arrive. And the craziest part? Caroline still had no idea Ava had uncovered everything. Instead of confronting anyone immediately, Ava made the decision that completely changed the trajectory of the story. She stopped thinking emotionally and started thinking strategically, exactly the way her father had taught her. Quietly, she contacted a litigation firm specializing in estate abuse and fiduciary misconduct, bringing copies of every trust document, transfer record, debt filing, and suspicious ownership change she had spent months gathering. At first even the attorneys looked stunned. Missing disclosures. Altered trust execution timelines. Unauthorized leverage against protected assets. Hidden ownership chains. It wasn't just messy, it looked deliberate. And when forensic accountants traced the financial trail, things somehow got worse. Caroline and Mason had structured shell entities to move estate funds into personal ventures, luxury spending, and speculative investments that failed spectacularly. The legal team described it as systemic misuse hidden behind grief and family authority. But here's where the story takes the turn nobody saw coming. 7. Because Caroline's financial empire was collapsing so badly, lenders had already begun preparing forced restructuring measures on Holloway Holdings, the very company controlling the family properties. Normally, outside investors would circle like sharks and carve everything apart. Except Ava did something absolutely unbelievable. Instead of waiting for the collapse, she used a combination of emergency legal protections tied to the trust and funding secured through silent partnerships backed by loyal former business associates of her father to position herself at the restructuring table. That sentence alone sounds insane, but hearing what happened next genuinely blew my mind. The same employees Caroline dismissed, ignored, or alienated remembered exactly who Ava's father trusted. Quietly, they helped her. Weeks later, Caroline hosted one final luxury event inside the mansion, desperately projecting success while creditors closed in behind the scenes. Guests drank expensive wine. Mason bragged online. Nobody knew disaster had already entered the room. Then came the meeting. Board members arrived. Attorneys entered. Financial representatives sat down. Caroline reportedly walked in confident, still assuming she controlled the narrative. She expected negotiations. Maybe sympathy. Maybe another delay. Instead, legal notices landed in front of her. Emergency injunctions froze disputed assets. Fraud investigations opened. Misappropriated estate activity entered formal review. Voting authority tied to improperly managed holdings was challenged. And sitting at the head of the restructuring table, the same inheritance she thought she buried forever, sat Ava Holloway. Bro, imagine the emotional whiplash. The teenager pushed into a tiny apartment after being told there was nothing left, had quietly returned as majority claimant and legal controlling authority over the very estate stolen from her. 8. And just when Caroline thought humiliation couldn't get worse, reality hit harder. The mansion. No longer hers to control. The company. Under restructuring led by Ava. The illusion. Completely shattered. The weeks after the restructuring felt strangely quiet, almost unsettling, because after years of manipulation, chaos, and betrayal, silence suddenly replaced survival mode. Ava Holloway didn't storm through the mansion celebrating or throw dramatic victories in anyone's face. Honestly, that restraint made everything hit harder. She walked through the property her father built with a kind of heavy calm, restoring order piece by piece instead of chasing revenge for revenge's sake. Financial audits continued. Misused assets were reviewed. Legal accountability moved forward through proper channels while independent oversight stabilized the company her father spent decades building. Former employees who had quietly stayed loyal finally returned, and for the first time in years, Holloway Holdings stopped feeling like a stage for greed and started resembling an actual legacy again. Caroline and Mason faced consequences they spent years believing would never touch them. Luxury vanished fast when borrowed money disappeared. Investigations followed paper trails they assumed nobody would ever question. And the image they fought so hard to protect quietly collapsed under its own weight. Meanwhile, Ava converted part of the estate into scholarship funding for grieving teens, saying something simple guided her choices now: power means very little if survival is the only thing you protect. And honestly, this story sticks with you because it hits a little too close to real life. People love saying karma isn't real, but sometimes karma looks less like instant payback and more like patience mixed with receipts. Ava didn't scream, chase revenge emotionally, or burn everything down in anger. 9. She learned, waited, documented, and came back stronger while the very people who betrayed her slowly collapsed under the weight of their own entitlement. Bro, that part genuinely stayed in my head because it reminds you how dangerous quiet determination can be. The people who underestimated her thought isolation would make her disappear, but instead it forced her to grow into the exact person capable of reclaiming everything. And if there's one takeaway here, it's this: greed can steal opportunity for a while, but eventually consequences collect interest.